My name is Jeffrey Gentry. I am an ABMDI registered death investigator and an IAI certified bloodstain pattern and senior crime scene analyst. And today, this podcast episode is going to be about train death investigations. And the reason that I chose train death investigations is because this is going out to all the people that may not have trains in their area, or maybe they're newer investigators and they've never handled a train death. And so they might not know exactly how to approach it. They might not know what happens when a train hits and kills somebody, whether it be a pedestrian or a person in a car. So I want to familiarize all the listeners with what actually happens. So first, we got to talk about when a train hits somebody. We all know how normal deaths are reported to an office, and then a death investigator will respond out. But what happens when a train hits somebody? What are the procedures? So first of all, there are freight trains, and then there are passenger trains. So in the area that I work, there are freight trains like BNSF or Union Pacific, and these are carrying freight. It could be like Amazon package, or it could be TVs going to Best Buy, or it could even be hazardous materials. And those trains are big, they're long, they're heavy, they're multiple hundreds of tons, and they get going at pretty good speeds. And they do hit people. They hit cars. But then you also have passenger trains like Amtrak. And those trains are moving. They are going fast. So when they hit somebody or a vehicle, they're going to do some serious damage. So there's a difference in the type of train lines. And then there's a difference in the speeds that these trains are traveling. And then, of course, the damage that they're going to inflict. When I think about trains, I think about when I'm hitting bugs on a windshield of my car. The forces that are involved are extreme when you're talking about trains. They do not move. So when a person is hit by a train or a vehicle is hit by a train, there's going to be some major damage. When a train hits somebody, first thing that happens is they usually stop, if they're even aware that they hit somebody. I've had cases before where a train hits somebody and doesn't even realize that there was a fatality. They keep going. The train is no longer on scene and a body is just found on the tracks. Been to many like that. And then it makes it a little more difficult to investigate, but not impossible. So let's assume that train hits somebody, the train stops, they get out, the conductor, the engineer, they will confirm that the person is deceased. They'll call law enforcement out. So first, it's usually going to be just your general law enforcement agency that comes out to the scene. They're going to investigate. They're going to get a couple questions answered from the conductor and the engineer. What did they see? What time did the accident occur? And then they're going to defer to a railroad police officer. So all of these major railroad companies like Amtrak, BNSF, Union Pacific, they all have railroad police. So just like your city police or your county police or county deputies, these railroad companies, they have police officers. They're usually handling large areas, but they'll respond out to like major crimes, theft, trespassing, and then they also respond out to fatalities. So they're going to get you a lot more specific information. They're going to usually interview the conductor, the engineer, and they're going to get you information about what did these people see? Did they witness the accident? Where was this victim standing on the tracks? Were they facing the train or were they looking away? So those are all really important questions, and I'll explain to you what type of questions you should ask when you go out to these scenes and what type of information you should gather. Also, one thing you have to think about is when that train stops, they're going to call the death investigator out. And remember, when that body is there on the tracks or next to the tracks, it is the coroner or medical examiner's jurisdiction, even though there is a police law enforcement agency or a railroad law enforcement agency on scene. So that is your jurisdiction as a death investigator. And you can say whether that train can keep going, depending on where the body is on the tracks, or whether they have to stay on scene so you can get photographs of the train, so you can get photographs underneath the train. Because typically there's going to be blood, there's blood spatter, there's tissue that's there on scene. And the death investigator is responsible for all of that. There could even be parts that are stuck to the train that you need to collect. So they have to take that into consideration before they just take off. Usually for myself, I like to let the trains leave, but they also have to switch out their staff whenever they have a fatality. So a lot of times when I respond out to a scene, it might be a half hour, 45 minutes, sometimes even up to an hour before I get to that scene. And when I get there, the staff that was involved in the fatality, like the conductor, the engineer, anybody who was up front in the train, in the engine, they will be leaving and they get replaced with a new crew. So that's pretty standard. One of the ones that really stands out to me that was pretty crazy is, again, I've got a lot of railroad tracks in my jurisdiction. This was a freight train that hit somebody. There was a guy that was in an Uber. He actually Ubered to the railroad tracks. He got out, jumped in front of the train, and was hit. So there was a fatality in the city. I responded out to that suicide. It got determined to be a suicide. Then while I was making notification to that family, it was maybe a half hour later, that same train, the exact same train, was going a little further south through the county, and they hit another person. This was an accidental death. The person was on the tracks. I believe they were jogging or doing something on the tracks. But that exact same train hit another person, and again, another fatality occurred. And so I had to respond out to that scene as well. And so they had to then swap out that crew for a whole new crew. So it's pretty crazy, some of the different things that can happen. Trains is completely different than like a vehicle accident or your typical suicide. They're big, they're outdoors, it's rough terrain, it can be very messy. I've had some pretty rough scenes where I've been out on scene for multiple hours, picking up body parts, tissue, examining the train to make sure that I didn't miss anything, because when people are dismembered or parts of their body come off, they can get stuck on the train. And if you're not paying attention and you're not doing an inventory of your body parts, you might miss something, and then it's going to end up somewhere else in another county and initiate a whole new investigation. Plus, you'd have to answer why you didn't collect all those body parts. So that's kind of how it works when a train accident occurs. That discusses a little bit about jurisdiction, who's going to handle the case, and then when the death investigator comes out, what they're going to do. So what kind of questions should you be asking at the scene of a railroad accident? As a death investigator, what's important to you? Remember, it's cause and manner of death. So your whole job is centered around determining cause and manner of death. Cause of death is usually very straightforward in train accidents. If it's a pedestrian hit by a train, it's going to be blunt trauma. Absolutely. If that person's in a vehicle and they're struck by a train, again, blunt trauma. So just like a car accident, what gets very complicated in train accident cases or train investigations is the manner of death. That's where it gets a little complicated. So it could be a natural death, but usually not likely, right? Because for it to be a natural death and be hit by a train, you'd have to literally be walking, be disoriented, and then hit by a train. But then it's considered an accident. Usually the scenarios that you're trying to rule out is this an accident? Is this a suicide? That occurs a lot. Or is it a homicide? And so you think about, how could a train fatality be a homicide? Well, I had a case one time where there was a man that was found dead on the tracks. It was in an area that was more of an industrial area, and he was laying on the tracks, and he'd obviously been run over multiple times. These trains didn't realize that they had hit him. So these trains in this industrial area, they were going back and forth, loading up cargo. And so they must have run over him 20 times or so. And he was spread out over a distance of probably 100 feet. It was very difficult to investigate. It was very difficult to find all of him. Plus, it was nighttime on top of that. So we were using flashlights. It was in an area where a lot of unhoused people lived. So there was a lot of debris around. We didn't know what property belonged to him, what belonged to other people. But at the end of the day, we recovered the body. There was no way that we could tell whether there were any postmortem injuries or injuries before he was hit by the train. What we later found out was that some people in the area were saying that this man got a check, and that some people jumped him, stole the check, and then left him for dead on the tracks. And then that was when he got run over. But we could never figure out if that was true. So the investigation went nowhere. And we ultimately ended up calling it undetermined. So you have that option, and you might have to use that in some of your train investigations when you don't know if it's an accident, or if you don't know it's a homicide, or you might not know it's a suicide. So keep that in mind, that train death investigations can be very complicated. So what are some of the questions that you need to ask when you're out on scene of your train death investigation? And if you've never been out on one, it can be overwhelming. These trains are huge. It's scary out there. If there's multiple train lines going back and forth, make for darn sure that there are no other trains coming either way, because you could end up being a fatality yourself if you're not paying attention. But what kind of questions do you need to ask? So if it's a pedestrian, obviously you need to know the time the accident occurred. That's going to go on your death certificate. You need to know the direction of the train's travel. I always ask, where was the train going to and from? That could be important. Maybe staff was tired. Maybe they didn't see something. What about weather conditions? If there was fog, I've had train fatalities in fog. What about rain? So you need to know the weather conditions. You need to know the time of the accident. And then if anybody witnessed it. A lot of times your very best resource in any of these investigations is going to be the conductor and the engineer, because they're right there. They're looking at it. But a lot of the modern trains now, even the freight trains, they have a camera mounted to the front of them. And so during the course of your investigation, you can get access to that information and possibly review still photos or images of the decedent just before they were hit by the train. That can be really important in determining whether this is an accident or suicide, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you want to know, where was the pedestrian at when they were hit, if it was a pedestrian? Were they walking across the tracks? Were the railroad crossing arms down? Was the train making noise? Were they sounding their horn? Did the train have a light on? Could this pedestrian possibly see the train? How fast was the train going? And then, of course, what direction of travel? Were there multiple train lines in that area? So, like, for example, was there one train going one way and then another train going the opposite way, so the pedestrian couldn't see it? I've had cases like that where a man was on a bicycle and he thought that the one train had passed. So as soon as that train passed, he went out into the intersection before the railroad crossing arms went back up, and he was struck by a train. So that's actually pretty common. That's how a lot of people get hit. So directions of travel, time of the accident, the weather conditions, visibility, all of that's really important. And then, of course, trying to see if you can get video of the train. Was this person walking, or were they on a bicycle? What about in a wheelchair? We've had cases like that too, where people are in wheelchairs, or they're having a medical issue to where they think they can beat the train, but they can't. I've seen video of one where a lady was struggling to walk across the street, and she could see the train coming, and she knew it was coming, but she couldn't go back. And so she had to keep going further, and that was when she was hit. So that was absolutely an accident, because she didn't intend to be hit. It just came up on her too fast. And those the big trains like that, they're very deceiving. It's they're coming really fast, and when you're looking at it head on, it's near impossible to determine their speed. So they're there before you even know it. So if they're a pedestrian, were they wearing helmets? Were they wearing reflective clothing? All of those things are important. What about distractions? So I've also had cases where people are on their cell phones and they get hit by trains. I've also had cases where people are jogging on the railroad tracks. Do you think that that is impossible? I mean, how could somebody not hear a train coming, or how could they not feel a train coming? But it is possible. If you're that distracted, you may not hear the train coming. You may not see it. And I've had a couple like that now, where people are listening to their earphones and they're actually exercising on the railroad tracks, which is the worst thing in the world to do. And they still end up getting hit. It always amazes me that's even possible, but it does happen. So those are the type of things that you need to be aware of. Then you want to consider, how you're going to identify this person. So you get your basic information, you start your investigation, you're looking over the body, and in some cases, the body is going to be complete, maybe just have some major lacerations or quite a few abrasions, because there's a lot of rocks around railroad tracks usually. And so that person, once they get hit, they're going to either be kicked off to the side. They have something in the front called a cow catcher, and it's literally that. It's designed to move things out of the way in front of the train. That way it doesn't derail. And so the person gets kicked off to the side. That's pretty common. So usually they're going to have like a major head injury, chest injury, but then they're going to have abrasions from skidding across the rocks, and then they come to rest. If the person is lying on the tracks, they could possibly be cut in half. They could have arms removed, legs removed. I've had all of those scenarios when investigating train accident cases. And that's when it gets a little complicated. So if they have like major facial trauma or major injuries to their body, then you have issues with identifying the person. So you want to be really thorough when you're looking around that scene. You want to look for any identifying property. Even if it's something that may not belong to the person, you want to possibly collect it or photograph it, because you never know how it could be used. I've had cases where somebody's out mourning the loss of a friend who died at a railroad crossing. And so there was a 6-pack of beers, there was a backpack. And then this person decided, they were so sad from that, they were intoxicated, then they themselves went out and jumped in front of the train. So there's so many different scenarios that can come up, but you first want to make sure when you're out at the scene, you're looking for property to identify the person. Then you want to look at the body. That's going to be really important because, like the one case that I mentioned, the guy that got jumped and then laid out on the tracks, it is possible that somebody could use trauma from a train to disguise injuries. That does happen in other countries where there's a lot of train lines. I've only seen a couple like that where we thought that the death was suspicious, but you really have to make sure that you're doing a full head-to-toe examination. You want to make sure you have all of your body parts. You don't want to leave anything out at a scene. You don't want to leave bone fragments. You don't want to leave tissue. It is difficult to find all of those things, especially if you're working at night. I've had to go out to the scenes the next day, maybe even a couple days in a row, just to make sure that I'm doing a thorough investigation and getting all of that person's body parts. That is your job as a death investigator, and you should take pride in doing that, making sure that you do a thorough investigation and you're collecting everything. So we've talked about the type of questions we need to ask. Now, cause and manner of death. So the big part is manner of death. How do we determine that? So let's talk about a couple scenarios. So say you've got somebody that is walking across the tracks, no evidence that they are in distress, and then they're hit by a train. So in that scenario, you could possibly say that's an accident. If somebody's out jogging, that's an accident. If somebody is trying to beat the train tracks in their car or beat the train in their car, they go around the crossing arms and they get hit. That's typically going to be an accident. But then you have to consider that person's history. What if that person was depressed? What if they had mental illness? What if they had left a suicide note and said that they were going to get hit by a train? I had one death where this guy and his girlfriend, they made a suicide pact that, if one of them was killed by a train, that the other one was going to get killed by a train. And that is exactly what happened. So it appeared to be an accident at first, but then when I went to go notify the family filled me in about this person's history, and then so it ended up being classified as a suicide. So you never know what's going to happen, and you want to get as much information at the scene as possible, and you have to do your thorough, detailed investigation. Now, suicides. We do get a lot of suicide train deaths in my jurisdiction, and I've seen people lay out on the tracks. I've seen people sitting on the tracks. I've seen people go up in front of the train, stare at it while the train is coming and walk into the train. I've seen people, they will sit there on the railroad crossing arms and wait to be hit. I saw one guy one time where he was out and he was praying on the tracks. And then when the train came, he turned his back to it. So he couldn't stand to look at it when he was hit. So there's so many different things that could happen. I had one where there was a person in a car, they were fighting with their spouse, and then the one person drove out in front of the train. And so there's so many different scenarios that could happen. You just have to make sure that you're asking all the appropriate information, doing detailed photographs, and examining that body at the scene. That's going to be critical because you don't want something to come up later during your autopsy exam that you missed. It all kind of plays out at the end if you get the appropriate information. So that kind of discusses what happens when a train death occurs, what you should be doing as a death investigator out at your scene, how you should approach these cases. I've given you a couple of scenario examples. If you are interested in learning more about train death investigation, I am an author. I have a couple of different books. One of my newer books is Death Investigation, Information to Obtain as a Forensic Death Investigator, and that goes through all of these detailed questions that you should ask at all different death type scenes. And that's available on Amazon. I also have several other books. I have a book about bloodstain pattern analysis. That's one of my favorite things to do. And then I also have a book about suicide death investigation, which also incorporates information and scenarios related to suicide investigation. Of course, these are all texts that go along with my classes that are available online at the Death Investigation Academy. You can find all of them online. My name is Jeffrey Gentry. I also have a cartoon book about death investigation, and I love teaching everything bloodstain pattern related, everything death investigation related. I love sharing my experiences. I've worked well over 3,500 death investigation cases. I've worked over 300 homicides, more than 350 suicides, and I have been out to numerous investigation death cases. And they are some of the most challenging just because there's a lot that goes into it. It's pretty overwhelming when you're out there on scene with a train that is just so massive, considering, your scene safety, and then you have to look at the body, and then you also have to figure out, what is this person's cause of death, and then what is their manner of death.